It's the year 72 BC, and we find ourselves in Ariminum, a coastal city on the northeastern edge of Italy. Here, the Roman legate Mummius believes fortune is about to hand him an easy victory. He positions his legions carefully, moving them in behind the rebel army led by Spartacus. His instructions from command are crystal clear: do not engage. But with the enemy so close, the chance feels irresistible. Mummius can't hold back. Convinced the fight will be quick and decisive, he throws his soldiers forward against the rebels. But the plan unravels almost instantly. Spartacus' followers aren't just runaways. Many are seasoned fighters, including former gladiators who know the art of close combat all too well. Even more, they're battling for something greater, their freedom. With that fierce determination, they smash through Mummius' ranks. In no time, the Roman formation collapses, and panic spreads as legionaries scatter across the field. Mummius had gravely misjudged the strength of his opponents. His defeat is humiliating, and humiliation is something Rome's commander, Marcus Licinius Crassus, cannot tolerate. For Mummius and his men, punishment is certain. To enforce discipline, Crassus turns to a brutal tradition from Rome's early days, a punishment we now call decimation. Mummius' legions are brought before the rest of the army. A tribune steps forward, reading out the charges: cowardice, disorder, failure in battle. For Roman soldiers, such failings are intolerable. Then Crassus himself appears, delivering a stern address. He condemns Mummius and his troops, reminding them of the larger danger. The rebellion led by Spartacus is not a mere uprising. It threatens the stability of Rome, even the Republic's very survival. Rome's safety rests in its legions. If they falter, so too does the Republic. And so the ritual begins. From every disgraced cohort, the names of soldiers are written on slips and placed inside an overturned helmet. For each group of about 80 men, 8 names are drawn. The punishment touches every man, but fate decides who will pay the ultimate price. 10% will be put to death, not for their own mistakes, but as a warning to all. As the tribune moves from cohort to cohort, legionaries bow their heads, eyes shut tight, dreading the moment their name might be spoken. Silent prayers tremble on their lips, whispered to any god who might hear. Each man begs fate to spare him, hoping for just one more chance. But the drawing continues. Names are called, and the unlucky are brought forward before the rest of their cohort. Those left behind breathe out in relief. They mourn their comrades, yes, but deep down they're thankful it isn't their turn. The chosen men kneel. Then, with a single swing of the axe, their punishment is carried out. As their bodies fall into the dust, the rest look on, shaken. The message is unmistakable. Hesitation, disobedience, or failure in duty will not be forgiven. In the Roman view, one soldier's weakness endangers them all. Mummius himself is disgraced. His force is diminished by 10%, yet his own life and those of the survivors is spared. Still, their ordeal does not end here. Plutarch, the ancient historian, describes another case of decimation where survivors were kept on coarse barley rations instead of the wheat usually given to Roman troops. They were also forced to camp outside the safety of the main encampment. In short, they were branded as an example, a living reminder to the rest of the army of what happens when discipline breaks, and of what every soldier must avoid at all costs. What we're looking at here is one of Rome's most infamous punishments: decimation. The earliest reference comes from the historian Livy, who tells us that in 471 BC the consul Appius Claudius Crassus Sabinus ordered the execution of every 10th man after his soldiers mutinied during a campaign against the Equi and Volsci tribes. At least that's how Livy presents it. Whether this decimation actually happened is uncertain. In fact, some evidence suggests that during the early Republic, the punishment may have been more legend than reality. Later writers like Polybius, however, describe the process in striking detail. His account lines up with what Plutarch and Frontinus would later record. From this, it seems clear that the idea of decimation was well known, even if the real-world examples were rare. And that's unusual because Roman punishments were usually well documented. So why so few records? The most likely explanation is that decimation served more as a looming threat than as a common practice. A symbolic warning, rather than an everyday tool of discipline. But by the 1st century BC, the situation had shifted. Decimation stepped out of myth and into harsh reality. Generals of this turbulent age wanted to revive what they believed were the stern values of the early republic, even if those values came from questionable history. Crassus was one of those generals. And during the Third Servile War, he brought decimation crashing down upon Mummius and his men. In some respects, it shouldn't come as a shock. Despite the lighthearted, "I'm Spartacus" jokes we hear today, the Third Servile War between 73 and 71 BC was no laughing matter. It posed a real danger to Rome's stability. Spartacus's uprising wasn't just a disturbance. It had the potential to bring down the Republic itself. At the Battle of Mount Vesuvius in 73 BC, a small band of about 70 gladiators used clever hit-and-run tactics to outmaneuver 3,000 Roman militia. They even may have struck down their commander, Gaius Claudius Glaber. Faced with this, Crassus knew his soldiers had to hold their ground. There was no room for leniency. That's where the practice of decimation entered the story. Strange and old-fashioned as it seemed, it left no doubt about the consequences of failure. Some ancient writers claimed Crassus executed as many as 4,000 men, but that number is almost certainly inflated. It would have been senseless to weaken his own army during such a critical crisis. More likely, around 50 soldiers were put to death. The reasoning was clear: deliver a harsh warning without crippling the force itself. This pattern shows up often in Roman history: punish enough to make an example but keep the unit able to fight. Julius Caesar did the same in 49 BC when he disciplined a mutiny, though in his case the number was closer to a dozen. Mark Antony may have followed suit a few years later, although Cicero's account suggests Antony selected particular offenders instead of leaving it to chance. If true, that wasn't really decimation, whatever the head count might have been. Still, according to Plutarch, Antony did indeed resort to decimation in 39 BC after setbacks during his Parthian campaign. The historian describes it this way: Antony gathered the soldiers accused of cowardice, divided them into groups of 10, and had one man from each group executed at random. As for the survivors, they weren't let off lightly. They were punished with coarse barley rations instead of the usual wheat. But how effective were these punishments, really? Yes, Crassus did eventually crush Spartacus's uprising. Yet the question remains, would he have managed it without decimating Mummius's men? Most historians believe he probably could have. As for Mark Antony, he did achieve success in his Parthian campaign. But was his harsh display of discipline against a beaten legion truly decisive? The answer is likely no. In reality, this kind of dramatic retribution against soldiers who had failed in battle rarely changed the outcome of a campaign. Rome's victories were built on strategy, discipline, and superior equipment, not on symbolic punishments. In fact, decimation could easily backfire. Soldiers who witnessed comrades executed at random might grow resentful, or even consider mutiny. The historian G.R. Watson put it bluntly: while the army might carry out punishments on enslaved captives without hesitation, professional soldiers could hardly be expected to take part in the indiscriminate killing of their fellow fighters. This explains why proven examples of decimation are so scarce. There are a handful of possible cases: Octavian in 34 BC and Lucius Apronius in 19 AD. But overall, only about a dozen instances have been firmly recorded. Later on, Emperor Macrinus even experimented with a softer version called centesimatio, where every 100th soldier was punished instead of every 10th. That alternative, however, never became common practice. In truth, decimation was both rare and, in practical terms, not especially effective. But as a threat, as a looming possibility whispered through the ranks, that may have been where its real power lay, keeping legions in check through fear alone. Decimation may also have carried another purpose. It forced soldiers to depend on one another. Every legionnaire knew their fate was tied to the courage of the man beside them. If one faltered, all might pay the price. That symbolic weight is what kept the idea of decimation alive long after Rome itself had fallen. Centuries later, during the 30 Years' War, the practice made a surprising return. At the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, More than 1,200 years after the Visigoths stormed Rome, this grim tradition resurfaced. The clash was one of the bloodiest of the war. The armies of the Holy Roman Empire and Sweden collided in a desperate struggle, leaving massive losses on both sides. The Swedish emerged victorious, but their triumph was hollow. Their king, Gustavus Adolphus, was killed in the fighting. Amid the chaos, one regiment serving under Gottfried Heinrich Graf zu Pappenheim broke under pressure and fled the field. For this, they were condemned as cowards. After initial executions, the rest of the regiment faced decimation. Roughly a tenth of the soldiers were hanged, while the remainder endured humiliations and public punishments. The goal was not just discipline, it was the deliberate destruction of the unit itself. The pattern repeated 10 years later at the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1642. Once again, Swedish and imperial forces met in a decisive clash. Colonel Madlow's cavalry was accused of abandoning the field without striking a blow. As punishment, his troops were court-martialed and subjected to ritual disgrace. 6 regiments that had fought bravely were summoned to witness the scene. Surrounded by their peers, Madlow's men endured jeers and insults as their regimental banners were ripped apart. Then came the final blow. Dice rolls determined 90 condemned soldiers. Officers were executed by the sword, while the others were hanged. Their bodies were left displayed along the road between Rocken and Lutzen, a chilling reminder to all of the price of dishonor within the Holy Roman Army. The story of decimation doesn't end in the ancient world. It reappeared even in the First World War, when commanders were desperate to hold discipline together amid the chaos of industrial warfare. One of its strongest supporters was Luigi Cadorna, the Italian commander-in-chief, who was infamous for his rigid discipline. True to his reputation, Cadorna turned to decimation more than once. Italian forces are recorded as using the practice at least 5 times during the war. In one case, 12 men were chosen at random from a unit that had fled and were executed in May 1916. As conditions for Italy grew more desperate, Cadorna relied on the punishment to try and control outbreaks of rebellion. On July 16, 1917, during a mutiny, 28 soldiers from the 142nd Regiment were selected by lot and put to death. Later that same year came disaster at the Battle of Caporetto. The Italian lines collapsed under the Austro-Hungarian advance, leading to a chaotic retreat. Soon after, Cadorna was dismissed from command. His legacy remains hotly debated. Many view him as a symbol of failure, a general whose harsh measures nearly cost Italy the war. Others see him as a strict but misunderstood tactician, facing the impossible conditions of Alpine warfare. Yet most accounts agree on one point: his cruelty towards his own men. And that cruelty rarely paid off. For years, Italian and Austro-Hungarian forces fought to a bloody standstill along the Isonzo River, only for the front to break disastrously at Caporetto. It was Cadorna's successor, Armando Diaz, who abandoned those harsh punishments and rebuilt morale. Under his leadership, Italy achieved victory in 1918, without resorting to decimation. Nor were the Italians alone in keeping the practice alive. The Russian army didn't formally outlaw decimation until 1920, and reports suggest it was used even later, during the Spanish Civil War at the Battle of Teruel in 1938. Today, though, the meaning of the word has shifted entirely. What once referred to a brutal military punishment has become a simple metaphor for large-scale destruction or loss. Today, when we use the word decimation, we usually mean complete annihilation, the total destruction of an army or group. But in reality, the Roman practice was nothing of the sort. Decimation was symbolic. It was meant to forge a shared identity within the unit, reminding soldiers that victory and defeat were collective, and that responsibility was shared among comrades. On the surface, it might seem unfair to punish 10% of a legion at random rather than single out individual offenders. Yet this randomness was exactly the point. Roman legions prized unity above all else. Individual bravery mattered less than the discipline of the whole formation. Their punishments reflected this same philosophy. Decimation reinforced the idea that a soldier's fate was tied to the cohesion of the group. It also served as a grim incentive to keep fighting, even when all hope seemed lost. Historian Lewis Rawlings noted that at the Battle of Cannae, defeated armies often suffered casualties of about 10%, almost exactly the rate of a decimation. Faced with those odds, a soldier might reason that it was better to fight on, with at least some control over survival, than leave it to chance. Still, the threat of decimation often carried more weight than its reality. Killing 1/10 of your own troops was rarely practical, even if they had failed in battle. That's why, across centuries of Roman warfare, the punishment was used only sparingly, perhaps a dozen times at most. Later, however, the idea evolved. Instead of applying it to their own men, some commanders used decimation as a way to punish their enemies. And that takes us to one of the last and most unusual stories of the practice during the Finnish Civil War in 1918. In February of that year, the Finnish White Army surrounded a poorly armed contingent of the Socialist Finnish Red Army. From the start, the outcome seemed all but decided. Even so, the Red soldiers managed to hold out for 2 full days, though they barely had enough weapons to share among them. At last, when their ammunition was gone, about 700 emerged from the mill where they had taken shelter, their hands raised in surrender. What happened next became infamous as the Lottery of Hruslahti. From the captured column, men were chosen at random and marched onto the frozen surface of Lake Hruslahti. By then, the outcome was already grim. The White commander, Karl Mannerheim, had declared that anyone who had stood against his forces must face execution. The Reds, poorly armed though they had been, still counted as fighters in the eyes of their captors. And so the lottery began. The sound of gunfire echoed across the ice, sharp and chilling in the winter air. One by one, the chosen men collapsed onto the frozen ground. Some reports claim that around 80 Reds were executed that day. For the survivors, it was nothing short of decimation. The unit had been broken, both physically and in spirit. There was also a practical logic behind the cruelty. The Whites wanted to send a clear message. Resistance would be crushed swiftly and without hesitation. Selecting victims by lot made the killings seem random, heightening the fear while also conserving resources. The result was devastating. A significant number of Reds lost their lives, while the rest were left shaken and demoralized. And the Whites had accomplished all of this without expending much ammunition. In more recent years, however, many historians have questioned what truly happened on the ice at Hruslahti. The executions did occur, but they may not have been random after all. Evidence suggests the men chosen were likely singled out for their roles as leaders or social organizers. If that's the case, then it wasn't decimation in the Roman sense. It was simply the mass execution of surrendered soldiers. And here we see once again the symbolic weight of the word decimation. By letting their enemies believe such a punishment had taken place, the White Finns tapped into the ancient Roman language of discipline. It transformed a grim killing into something cloaked with the appearance of tradition and authority. By framing it as a decimation, they could present it not as a war crime, but as if it were a noble echo of Rome's martial past. It was the power of rhetoric, turning an atrocity into something that sounded almost respectable.